Pues ahora sí, oficialmente bienvenidos sean todos a el primer año de los que esperamos sean muchísimos de The Open Banking, Fintech and Blockchain Summit. Vamos a abrir con broche de oro porque ya está aquí, lista. Y ha sido un placer hablar con ella allá afuera, así que seguramente estar aquí con ella va a ser también un enorme placer. Andrea Kates está con nosotros. Tal vez a muchos de ustedes su nombre no les sea tan familiar, pero a todas las personas en San Francisco, sobre todo a aquellos creadores de empresas unicornio, pues les es no solo muy familiar, pero muy importante. Así que doy la bienvenida a Andrea y en lo que viene para acá, déjenme pedirles que precisamente como decía Mario, vayan bajando nuestra aplicación de UVA para que más tarde les pueda ir diciendo todos los beneficios que tendrán con ella. Andrea,
gracias.
Welcome.
Thank you. Gracias. So I just have to say, it has been a hell of a crazy week. There are things that have happened this week that are so unpredictable that even a person like me that prides myself on number one, making really great bets, because I always make a bet on, like, I think Michael Bloomberg might be the next president of the United States. Might win that bet, might not win that bet. I make bets on fintech all the time, blockchain all the time, and I always try to figure out, number one, how much money will be made in the first half hour of Singles Day. I lost my bet because it has been a crazy week. It's a crazy week because all of us here start realizing that everything that is in the world that we are accustomed to, that we were taught in traditional business strategy, that we do in our day-to-day lives as bankers or people in payments or any part of the industry that touches what we'll talk about today, blockchain, payments, banking, it's completely impossible to predict. So Google, I guess, is going to be lending money, and I guess that, $10 billion in the first half hour seems to make sense to somebody in the payments world. And also, we didn't like Calibra too well. That didn't go over too well, but now Facebook has another idea with Facebook Pay. And so the thought here is for all of us to just take a moment and think, what's coming next that we see the early signs of, and where might we be completely unable to make a bet that will come true? I view it as a world of these tectonic plates. And to me, we're in the most exciting time in fintech, blockchain, banking, and payments because we have no ability to predict whether the person next to us is our next competitor or is going to be our next bedfellow. And I will be talking today about my favorite word, which is I encourage all of us today to become good bedfellows. So, there's a large world. Mexico is part of it. We are not necessarily the leaders. However, with the right leadership in this room and the people that we touch and the bedfellows that we select, I know that we are going to start some sort of revolutions. There's absolutely no question. Now, I live in the United States. Very humbling to feel like you're from Silicon Valley, and when you go other places, they should welcome you with open arms. Not so much these days, unfortunately. However, the Silicon Valley model has a lot to teach when it comes to the way we think about capital and the good, the bad, and the ugly of some of the very important concepts that we need to think about as we as leaders start to think about what we want to do next to take our place in the world. How we in this room can start to catalyze ideas that can make Mexico a huge leader in the next wave as these tectonic plates shift. And my question is, who's missing? Are we getting the right people to have a seat at that table? And as we start observing the bedfellows that we'll talk about, what are the things that we notice that we can accelerate so that we as leaders can think about what's our place going to be and who needs to be sitting next to us? Unfortunately, there's also going to be a little bit of play when some people don't make it. You know, they're just going to drown because it's complicated. They weren't fast enough. They didn't understand what the game's rules were in the new configuration. And so not everyone is going to be able to accelerate their progress based on this rising tide. But my thought is, if we think about things the way we'll talk about them right now, we have a chance of winning more bets. And so to me, it's this notion that with all of these shifts playing out in the world, how will Mexico become a leader on the global stage? I am a rational optimist. I am a practitioner and a strategist. And so I'm still doing the hard work. And I'll tell you about a couple projects I'm involved in that are really challenging. But I'm fortunate because I was the CEO of a SaaS company in Silicon Valley that was co-founded by the head of the lean startup movement. And so I got to understand the feeling of what it takes to have capital in that Silicon Valley environment, and to also understand what it takes to accelerate at a team level something that begins as an innovative idea and turns into a huge idea at scale. I live in San Francisco. We've got lots of problems, and we are all also asking ourselves all the time, how do we make an equitable society as we're being capitalists? And so we think about that a lot. And I'm also fortunate, and my son tells me that I sound braggy. I'm not trying to brag, but I just happen to have a job that fortunately takes me all over the world. I'm part of the fintech community in the Nordic region. I was very fortunate to be on the global advisory board to the fintech region, which includes people from India and Singapore and China and Europe and all over, and Latin America as well. And so from that perspective, I have now started to put together some thoughts I'll share with you that are part of a new body of knowledge that's beyond innovation. I think innovation has seen its day. The problem is not have new ideas. The problem is, how do we get to a future that actually uses these new ideas? And I'm really hoping that a year from now, when we're together again, that if you raise your hands and say, do you intend to do whatever, learn more about blockchain, find some Bedfellows, get some new business models, that the intent to do these new future ideas lives up to what you've actually done. That's my goal. And so the models, once again, I'm really lucky because with the software company, we got to see 13,000 teams winning and losing and trying to do blockchain and failing, trying to do IoT failing, financial models. And so we've come up with a system that we'll talk about today that's so simple. It's seeing things differently, learning, and I don't mean saying that you learned, it's really learning. Like some of this stuff is hard. Don't tell me that you want to do AI and machine learning. Everybody says that. Very few people take a Udacity course online to figure out what it is. And then making sure that we are able to use this information to advance this. And by the way, everyone, I encourage you to ask for these slides. I would absolutely love to start a dialogue with all of you and maybe even, seed some projects. And so what this is all about is for us in this room to have meetings when you go back and talk about see, learn, decide, commit, talk about Bedfellows and talk about future-proofing and actually commit to doing something. This is a group that I'm very proud to have worked with. It's a public story. Raise your hand if you have heard of SUMA Trust in Japan. SUMA Trust is, I think, the second largest trust bank. And I was very fortunate, as I said, to work on a team that helped to accelerate and catalyze the development of, can you guess what this project was about? You're right, it was a blockchain project. And in what industry? You're right, it was commercial real estate. And so the question was, how could you marry blockchain and the concept of real estate and develop some new business models that actually worked at scale? Because you can't just be a startup if you're SUMA Trust. These have to be very large projects that go to scale. And so I was very excited because actually the people on the right, including pretty young people, grabbed this thing, decided it was possible, learned the stuff, and figured out the models to bring this to fruition. And now there's partnerships that you can read about, one of which is with Jones Lang LaSalle, one of the largest commercial real estate companies in the world. And so this stuff works. It's not a theory. It's not someone from Silicon Valley telling you what you should do. It's just common sense to do these kinds of projects with other people and with a lot of expertise. I also honestly believe, and I've been coming to Mexico for a long time, including cooking school, where I learned how to make mole negro from the Zapotec Indians years ago. And I love Mexico. I think that Mexico is poised with so many of the distinctive characteristics to be a world leader in certain ways. Just like the Nordic region's not going to be China. Guess what? None of us is going to be China, right? No one's going to be Silicon Valley. There's a good and a bad side to Silicon Valley. So the question is, in this room, what is it uniquely, as we listen to the speakers over the next couple of days, what is it that we uniquely can do to galvanize ourselves, to build things at scale that no one else can touch because we have done it in a uniquely Mexican way? And so I'll start with the future-proofing and move into what I know you're dying to hear about, Bedfellows. So what is future-proofing? The way that we define it is to see ahead of market shifts, to learn really quickly, and to take action with full commitment. Now, we have coined this term because all of these things are important. I am not a futurist. I worked at one point, and I should not admit this on camera, but with Enron, and we thought that we had predictive models down pat. And the problem with perfect models is that when they don't work and you're not resilient, you go down fast. So the notion here is we pretty much in this room see what's happening, right? The first 3 slides I showed you, things are shifting. The banks today are not going to be the same way that the banks are tomorrow. There's just no way it's going to be the same. And so what can we do to get our feet not so full of clay and to be nimble, to learn things, to be in a state of learning, and to let even younger people on our teams, newer people from outside our industry, to inform and get us to get to the point where we really commit. Not talk about AI for the 5th time in a row, not think about blockchain, but actually make it work. So, I also am an optimist in that we are not victims of this crazy future that's coming. I mean, we're going to create it. It's here in small doses right now. And so what are the things we have to do to deal with the fact that every single time I work with teams, we know that financial banking and insurance is the most disruptible industry ever. And everyone is worried about it, and everyone is touched by it, because retail and consumer goods, everything is touched by payments. And we'll talk about the unbanked, which is this huge latent need that I know some companies in Mexico are dealing with, and others will come to serve as well. And the unbanked is a big issue especially when I work in other continents, where people have successfully gotten people. For instance, in Japan, we were trying to get a new type of investor, and we didn't know what they did with their money, because when you drew the pie chart, there was still something missing. And we said, well, what do you do with that? And they said, well, we keep it literally under our mattress. So although even people who trust the banks, a lot of people have not been fully committed to engaging with the financial institutions for many reasons. So now what I'd like to say is that, global fintech, everyone knows this. I hope you all take many pictures of these, because there's no doubt that it's growing like crazy. We're so lucky to be in a field that's about to take off like a rocket. And I'll go back if people wanted to see that again. Picture moment, yes, everyone should know this. This is another one, and once again, this is from CB Insights, and really like the fact that, once again, no doubt the trajectory is growing. That's really great news, because that's not true in so many industries. So we're lucky as possible. However, and also the regulatory changes happening in Mexico, including the 2020 changes. At the S&P Global Market Intelligence in March said that a lot of countries in Latin America are looking to Mexico as a model for regulation. Last night I won't tell you who it was with, but I had a really interesting conversation at the cocktail party where someone was talking about something I hadn't thought about before, which is that regulation is always slower than technology, right? So the technology is advancing really fast, and our regulations are just sluggish by nature. But even so, we're really optimistic about the fact that Mexico's regulatory environment is being responsive, and I can tell you from the Nordics, without that, you won't get anywhere. And with banks, and I'll be a little down on my own country now, with regulations that keep people out of the playing field, that only lasts so long. And I know from a workshop I went to last week in Portugal, the young blockchain people are out there trying to knock down the doors of the standard banking mindset. And so we know that platforms provide instant scale. We know that some of the big platforms, these are the ones that I'm familiar with, that I've worked with in Silicon Valley and on the West Coast of the United States. But we also have to talk about China. You saw on one of the slides that we just got back from doing a project in Shanghai on the future of cybersecurity for a large automotive company. And I can tell you that I was blown away. I hadn't been in China, and I really hadn't understood pretty much anything about the differences in cybersecurity in China and how quickly the consumer mindset has changed from where it was maybe even 5 years ago to where it is today. And so rather than whining about it, let's just understand that it is a force to contend with, and that in terms of scale and scope, it is a given. It's just going to outnumber so many of us, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a unique voice and a unique power in the way that we approach it. So for instance, I told you first that Alibaba had 38 billion Singles Day purchases this year, 2 days ago. But the numbers are mind-boggling. When I'm in places like Denmark, they look at these numbers, it's like, I don't think we've had $38 billion of business all year. It's just GDPs of large countries. And so the question is, what are we going to do about China? Well, I say two things. There's a book that I did not write that I think is fantastic called The Big Nine by Amy Webb. And what she talks about is the fact that there are already geopolitical lines of demarcation. And later I'll tell you, we call it the splinter net. Raise your hand if you've heard of the term, the splinter net. It's being able to think about the fact that, while I was in Shanghai on Tuesday, they closed down Zoom. It was no longer in China. And Thursday, when we had a Zoom call, we couldn't do it on Zoom, right? So the notion of control has a double edge, right? And also, there's a lot of talk, especially with GDPR in Europe, around privacy and security and trustworthiness. And certainly as we talk about Bedfellows, it's very important to understand that some people believe, and this is from Amy's book, that while we were sleeping, our privacy, security, data ownership switched from our hands to the hands of these big nine. And that's not okay with a lot of people, as you know. So let me now provoke you with this notion of Bedfellows. It's really different to do business with someone than to be their bedfellow. And the way that I explain it is un miembro de un ecosistema en quien usted tiene confía, con quien comparte intereses similares, tienen un trato justo, a quien usted apoya y con quien prosperan mutuamente a través de una relación en donde la ecuación es 1 + 1 más que 2. Okay, that is the first thing you learn. Okay. Sí, tengo una profesora de español y cada semana nosotros discutamos, pero tengo miedo de hablar español. Muchas gracias. So, the concept here is that it used to be that you could do literally competitive analysis. Raise your hand if you've ever done a SWOT diagram. Okay, or done competitive analysis, like traditional strategy. I certainly did. I taught it at business schools, right? But now, how do you make a competitive diagram that includes like everybody in the world who could go into payments, including somebody in a garage in Finland who just happened to learn some code from an Andrew Ng Udacity course? I mean, we cannot play the game of whack-a-mole fast enough to understand who we're going to be competing with, right? So Bedfellows is important. And unfortunately, we can't trust them all. And unfortunately, we have really bad track records ourselves of being good bedfellows, because when we get into deals with people, a lot of times we kind of mess with them. We don't treat them well. I worked for a large insurance company years ago for a large project for a large insurance company in the US, and we were trying to do online insurance. And guess what we were going to do? Disintermediate all of the salespeople. Right? So one day we love them, and the next day we're going to go around them. That's the nature of this game. And so the question is, what do you need in a bedfellow? Well, there are already some ways, and I recommend that on Monday, you go back to the office and do what I do every week. I trace the bedfellows. Who's doing what with whom? It's kind of like gossip for business. And then the question is, if he's dating her and she's dating him and it goes on like this, what is the big picture? So why are these alliances forming? So for instance, I'll talk about one that I know pretty well, Salesforce. We know that people are very interested in data visualization. So it makes so much sense that they would acquire Tableau, because as people need that as a latent, important need, they also need to be able to do it at scale. So if you just do this with your colleagues, I really think you can learn a lot. I started to do it with Mexico. I am not an expert in Mexico, but I started to try to play the game of bedfellows here. And I also would love to make the bet at some point today or tomorrow, who's going to be next on this list? So when we get together next, what will have happened and why? What is the unmet need that is causing these bedfellows? Are they geopolitical? Are they because you need a last payment transaction part? So let's look at a little bit of this. We know that the fintech overview is changing. It's not just payments anymore. And as I mentioned, we also have to think about the unbanked, because by definition, the unbanked are people we don't know anything about, because everything we currently do isn't working. It's not resonating, or they would be banked. And so the first thing that we have to understand is that these bedfellows and these relationships are really important to understand. And the second thing we have to understand is that it shifts really fast. And I want to say we can trust everyone, but not necessarily if we don't have a long view. You know, there are people that don't like Amazon, but I love the fact that, you know, he's straight out about it. If there's a margin to be had and you're not taking advantage of it, fair game. So there's a lot of examples of this, but I think that we talked about regulation. I think one of the things that Mexico can do well is regulatory for sure. I also think that access to capital is really important, and I don't think the Silicon Valley model is the one that's going to be universal at all. I think that responsiveness to trends is really important in terms of picking the bedfellows and being future-proofed. And how are you going to attract the best talent in the world? Because it all comes down to people. And I think the hardest thing to talk about is trust, because there's a trust with a small t and a trust with a capital T. But I know that when Cambridge Analytica happened, the people who wanted to work for them went down significantly. I know that there's techlash, there's a backlash, you know, should there be antitrust or people getting too big? Also, this notion I said earlier of splinternet. You know, there's these aligned interests geopolitically, and people can punish each other. Nope, you can't have XYZ platform in our country anymore. Goodbye. Who will you align with geopolitically? And security, I know that there was a breach here, and I do a lot of work in cybersecurity. And it's very important to understand that the public sentiment around fintech is largely related to the amount of trust that the public will put in our laps. And we have to earn that. And finally, of course, innovation. It's no question. I'm not saying that innovation is dead, but I'm saying that there's a future beyond the innovation. There's a future that's more connected, that's more visionary, that's more proactive around who we want to be, not just how do we look from an idea level at what can be new and the bright, shiny object, as my mentor used to say at Cisco. And I know that there's a lot of innovation happening in this market already. And I also remember that there are leapfrogs where, for instance, in China, I was in a 2,000-year-old town, and the only way to pay for the boat, not cash, not credit card, QR code. I'm like, they didn't even have bathrooms, but you had QR codes. So there's leapfrog technologies that I think are happening all over. So I really think that if we understand the needs of our customers, we're in good shape. I really think that by future-proofing our companies, we can do some very simple things. Let me summarize. See differently, learn, really learn. Don't just spout off a new term. Make a decision, because the worst thing is to not do anything. That's much worse than status quo. And commit, and I'll show you that in a minute. I will spare you my Spanish on this one, but it's worth taking a picture of this, because these are the 6 things that everyone needs to do to really future-proof. And by the way, you're the first audience that I've shared this with, because our book is coming out in December, and I'm very excited to have dialogue around this if you've got some thoughts. And also, we would love to come to your companies and just talk and have dialogue to develop more practitioner stories around how this all is working. How do you get beyond intending to do something? So the question is, do you catch up or give up? Honestly, with AI, I've given up. I've taken as many courses as I can. It's above my pay grade. When it gets really deep into the algorithms, I really let other people do it, so I give up. But there's lots of things I catch up on, and I'm constantly interested in. But it doesn't solve this mystery of calcium, which I'll leave you with. So I really know I should take calcium. I really want to take calcium. Every single time I go to the doctor, she tells me, you should take calcium. And then 6 months later, I come back and I'm taking calcium maybe for 3 or 4 weeks, and then I sort of stop taking calcium. Why? Because my normal life is a lot easier without it. There are a lot of things calcium does that I don't like, and I forget, and I have all these bottles of calcium. So what does it take from wanting to want to take calcium and actually taking calcium? And so what I would say is that, first of all, get scared. In my case, it's maybe I'll get osteoporosis. In your case, maybe it's, if you're not thinking about putting yourself out of business, I can promise you, the startups I just visited in Lisbon last week, they're thinking about it. They're sitting there hungry for your business, and they think that they're going to eat your lunch. Don't be a lone wolf. Don't do this alone. If you work with a startup, do not love them to death. Fund your evil twin. Someone from Santander Bank told me this in Denmark a couple months ago. If you're afraid of something, you better fund it, because that evil twin is going to come and get you. And then finally, there's a guy at ING in Brussels who has the best, I think it's the best thing in the world. If we're winning the snail race, it's not good enough. So we have to ask ourselves, are we winning the real race, or are we winning the race we've convinced ourselves is enough? And then finally, the notion of pigs and chickens. And I know you know this old joke, that in a ham and egg breakfast, the chickens are definitely committed, right? They've made a contribution. But the pigs are 100% committed. And so we have to, in this room, to get the energy that we need and the leadership that we need, we have to be pigs. And so once again, take this picture as well, because I'm happy to talk with you about it. It's ver, aprender, decidir y comprometer. And it's the only 4 things that will take you from deciding that you want to do something to actually doing it. And so I believe that our innovative future in Mexico is us. I know that's simple. And I think that there are some rules of thumb. Number 1, pick good bedfellows and be a good bedfellow. Number 2, please future-proof your company. Number 3, take the calcium. And number 4, please be a pig and not a chicken. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.